सवाल इसका जवाब दे। Lobbying is a global worry. Big corporations have a lot of money, they spend a lot of time on lobbying. If we can get the corruption part, the personal integrity part worked out at the top, lobbying will be there, just that it will not influence our policies unduly.
To my mind, lobbying is legal in India. What kind of lobbying? If you mean by lobbying using underhand means or corrupt means to get to an objective, it's illegal, and it's illegal in the United States too.
Assuming that lobbying is bribing, and that is absurd. I think we better learn to be a little more, business savvy before making such sweeping statements.
Walmart's lobbying disclosures for gaining access into the Indian markets led into a full-blown controversy, with the Indian government ordering a judicial probe. On We Mean Business today, we're asking if lobbying is necessarily a dirty word. Is there a fine dividing line between lobbying and bribery? And is there a need to have more clarity on lobbying laws in India? Let me introduce our guests on the show today. Ajay Dua, former Secretary in the Ministry of Industry and Commerce, with us here in the Delhi studio. Also Mr. Dilip Cherian, consulting partner of Perfect Relations. Joining us on a link, Mr. Vikram Singh Mehta, former chairman of Shell Group of Companies. Vivek Dahejia, economics professor and author of Indianomics, joins us from Mumbai, and Mr. A. Mahendran, MD of Godrej Consumer Products Limited, also joins us from Mumbai. But before we start this discussion, let's take a look at what World Bank Chief Economist Dr. Kaushik Basu had to say on lobbying and the recent Walmart controversy.
Lobbying is a global worry. Big corporations have a lot of money, they spend a lot of time on lobbying. India is becoming a global player, so we are entering a domain in which all the industrialized countries have already been. They always face lobbies from big corporations. India is now beginning to face. And here again, Shweta, I want to stress this. The personal integrity of people at the top is extremely important. People will come and lobby. They will come and say that, look, this is in our interest. You have to give them a hearing. But if you have integrity at the top, you give them a hearing, you take in their points, and then take an independent decision for the country. So if we can get the corruption part, the personal integrity part worked out at the top, lobbying will be there. That's a part of the industry's part of their exercise, just that it will not influence our policies unduly.
So what you're really saying is lobbying is a trend that it is here to stay, it will continue, but it all depends on how influenced we get by that lobbying. And it's not always necessary that just because lobbying happened, a decision actually took place.
I would love a world without lobbying. But if someone comes and makes a case, how do you stop that? And big corporations will spend money on just advertising their point of view. So it's a part of the world that I wish was not there, but it is there. So all I'm saying is that we have to learn to live with that, and we have to have integrity at the top. Right. That you give them a hearing, but you take your decisions in the interest of the country, whichever country you happen to be at the helm of. You take decisions in the interest of that country, but because it's a part of life.
And in this case particularly, you feel FDI and multi-brand retail was in the interest of the country. So the decision that was really taken by policymakers was in the interest of the country.
That's exactly my viewpoint, that Walmart may have asked for it, Carrefour may have asked for it, Tesco may have asked for it.
Right.
In the end, India took a decision in India's own interest. In this case, I do believe that it is in India's interest to let in these corporations. Again, a word of caution. You want your antitrust laws to be in place,
right,
your zoning laws to be in place, because you have to keep in mind that these are not international NGOs coming in. It's not Mother Teresa's group coming into India. Right. These are corporations coming in their own interest. They want to earn a profit in India.
Right.
So we have to have our laws in place, our zoning laws, our competition laws, to keep them in check.
An interesting view there from Dr. Kaushik Basu, Chief Economist of the World Bank. But is it all that easy to determine whether lobbying influenced policy making, or was it necessarily in the interest of the country? That's what we're trying to understand today on this very interesting discussion. A few days after we'd seen the entire controversy with regard to lobbying, we of course know that there will be a judicial probe into the entire matter. But let's try and understand this from a larger perspective. Mr. Vikram Singh Mehta, is there a very fine dividing line between lobbying and bribery?
In principle, no. Lobbying is a legitimate medium of democratic discourse. Everyone lobbies. The word lobbying itself has got somewhat charged, but if you were to use another word, you would find that every segment of our society does, in one form or the other, work hard to protect and further its interests. Consumer federations do that, industry federations do that. In some senses, you could argue that politicians lobby, and as I say, that word can be used differently, lobby to secure the votes of their constituents. And so this is a part of our democratic society, it's a part of democratic debate, and we need to be very clear that it is not something that is going to go away. Now, is there a fine line? Not in principle, because if you're illegal, if you break the laws of the land, you are in violation and you should be prosecuted. The laws of the land are very clearly demarcated, should be very clearly demarcated, and the line dividing the protection and furtherance of one's individual or collective interest and illegality should be very straightforward and well and transparently drawn. So there is no fine line. We have now made this issue into an unnecessarily volatile and perhaps raised this to a level of debate that should not have been there in the first place. I am a bit surprised that this subject is continually part of the part of discussions in channels like yours, because I just don't see the issue here. In India, the industry that is looking to protect its interest are certainly going to do it by trying to gain access to those people who make decisions, whether it's Indian industry, whether it's foreign industry. Now, there is clearly an issue here as far as the power of money. Some industrial groups have more money than others, and they are going to be more successful by virtue of their money power to access the influential opinion formers. Now, this is something that we can control. As Mr. Basu, as Dr. Basu said, if the rules relating to competition or if the rules relating to antitrust are very clearly demarcated, then there is a limit to how far large companies are going to be able to deploy money power. But unless and until that limit has been clearly and legally defined, I don't see anything wrong in a company looking to actually protect and further its interests. So in answer to your specific question, as I say, I don't think there's a thin line. There's a clear divide between what is legitimate and what is illegitimate. And there may be a thin line, however, between the bending of the law and the breaking of the law. And in certain situations, certainly companies and maybe individuals come very close to that line. They bend the law, but in the process of bending it, often they cross it. They cross that line, and in that sense, they break the law. And under those circumstances, I hope that the judicial system will alert us to that and prosecute those who are indeed in violation of the law.
All right, I think that's very well explained on part of Mr. Mehta. And here I'd like to ask Mr. Cherian, is lobbying a dirty word in India? Would you like to be called a lobbyist?
I have no anxiety about being called a lobbyist because in India, everybody lobbies. CII lobbies,
Right.
FICCI lobbies, NASSCOM lobbies in America, the carpet manufacturers lobby in America. So lobbying is one, legal, and two, legitimate. I think
Even in India?
Even in India.
Okay, even though we don't have any laws clearly defined that make it all, that give it that legitimacy as perhaps in the United States.
Because of the fact that we haven't defined either advocacy We haven't defined the work that lawyers do. Everybody is doing lobbying. Law firms are today among the country's largest lobbyists. Chartered accounting firms are also lobbying. So I think that there is, one, nothing illegal about it, and two, there is this attempt to create this figment of corruption as being linked to it, simply because both policymakers, and I divide policymakers into two kinds, bureaucrats and politicians, both would like to retain a kind of curtain over the process of decision making. The answer to whether lobbying is corrupt or not is resident in the way we do our policy making. If policy making is transparent, then whatever interest is being brought to bear, as Dr. Kaushik Basu said, is legitimate and open, as long as the final decision maker takes the decision in the interest of the country.
But Mr. Dua, how do you define that? How do you try and believe that this has been done, that the decision has been taken not because of lobbying or because of possible bribery or corruption, and simply because policymakers believe it's in the interest of the country?
Espousing a cause is lobbying. You may do that in private life, you may do it in business life, you may do it in public life. Any cause which is put forward is advocacy. Advocates do advocacy by the very, as a term. The fact of the matter is, we have to distinguish very clearly lobbying from bribery. They are two distinct facts, distinct terms. One is being practiced day in and out.
Right.
The other may be getting practiced, maybe its incidence may be getting increased, but that certainly is not a justified activity. Now, talking about lobbying, I think legally it's been defined only in two laws in the country, in the world, United States and Canada. Others do not. Slovenia has a law, so does Australia have a law, no other country has a law on the subject so far. The fact,
So it's no surprise that India does not.
No, for that matter, Shweta, even the United Kingdom,
Right.
they've been dithering over, dragging their feet on getting a law to regulate lobbying. What we need is not, we can't live in a denial mode forever, so that there is no lobbying in India. What we need is strong regulatory framework within which lobbying is practiced. When I say strong legal framework, I just refer to two things. One, by whom, for whom, and what for. And these are the things which we need to regulate, then things become transparent. But probably it's very simpler said than done, because in India we have to link it up with how does election funding, political funding take place.
Absolutely.
We've got to see that. We also have to see that some people may be better placed to advocate their cause, to lobby, because either they are better organized or they are better funded.
Right.
So what happens to people who are not in that advantageous position? How do we ensure that our policy making, our law making does not exclude their interests? So those are the kind of things which I think
We'll take forward all those concerns, but my question to Vivek Dahejia is the response to the Walmart lobbying disclosures in India. Were you taken by surprise? What's the kind of message that's being sent? At the same time, can we simply brush aside the fact that Walmart is facing a corruption probe with regard to several of its foreign subsidiaries? There are serious issues of bribery that are being probed, and Bharti Walmart has also sacked a number of employees, and according to reports, including its CFO, in possible bribery allegation charges.
Absolutely, Shweta. And just again to pick up on a couple of the themes that have been raised and your question, when this sort of whole issue broke in the news, about a week ago, I think actually your reporting was one of the few that picked up on the fact that there was an apparent confusion between perfectly legal lobbying by Walmart in the US and which got then conflated with bribery or allegations of bribery, with the much more problematic fact that Walmart itself has disclosed that it is being investigated or has put itself up for investigation under the US's own anti-corruption laws. And as you say, the Bharti, Walmart in India has suspended or sacked, whatever word you want to use, some of its top managers. So that certainly raises a red flag. The government has done the right thing by calling an inquiry. So let's see what comes out of that. But certainly, given the seriousness of the fact that Walmart itself, if you like, has put itself under the legal microscope in the US, we can't ignore that fact here in India. I'd also just to comment, if I could, briefly on the wider issue that you raised earlier, the sort of the taint or the charge that accompanies the term lobbying probably is because, as some of your guests have said, one doesn't always know exactly what goes on behind closed doors. So where does legal, proper, official lobbying end and illegal, undue influence begin? And that's where the Americans, whether you like it or not, have a system where lobbying has a set of rules. It's transparent, it's got to be disclosed. Not perfect, but surely that's a better way to go than to have this sort of morass, this gray area where we don't know what's legal, what's illegal, who's been affected, who's been influenced in what way. And just one last point, Shweta, we'll really never know, in a sense, if lobbying was effective in this case or any particular case, because the counterfactual, as you know, as we like to say as economists, we can't observe. In other words, what would have happened if Walmart hadn't lobbied? We'll never know that. We can't see that state of the world which never came into being. So we can infer from the fact that companies like Walmart spend millions of dollars, there must be some reason for doing that.
You were making a point.
I thought it might be useful to first just talk very briefly about the Walmart case,
Okay.
and then talk about
okay.
lobbying in
Fair
general.
enough. Fair
and
enough.
talking about Walmart, after all, what has come into public light? That in the United States, in a quarterly, mandatorily required quarterly report,
Right.
under the US laws, Walmart has disclosed that it spent over the last 5 years a certain amount of money, I think it was $25 million,
right.
roughly 125 crores,
right.
on getting market access, on influencing the US lawmakers on better market access in countries like India, and they have given the expenditure which is required under the law, staff costs, consultant costs, and other kind of incidental expenditures. Those are the media reports which came in. On
But
that,
do we believe that all that is just about...
no,
yeah,
it's slightly different
Okay.
from what, if you will recall, Shweta, way back in 1997, Enron disclosed that it has spent a certain amount of money
in educating
Indians.
Exactly.
That was somewhat different from what has been disclosed now. Nowhere has the disclosures been made that money was spent in India or on Indians.
But we're not ruling that out
No,
either.
we are not. So that
we're not
is where-
ruling that out either. And what stops, in turn, US chambers of commerce or US India chambers or any of those from coming and lobbying their cause once again in India?
No, but I think the point Mr. Dua is making is quite significant with Walmart. You're talking of $25 million over 3 years, over 5 years across 4 countries.
Right.
So Indians must be pretty cheap to lobby if this is what the figure we are talking about.
Okay,
so there is an issue here.
Irrespective of the figure here, it's about the larger principle of whether this in turn means that there would have been any act of, and I totally agree with you when you're saying that this is the amount that they have spent in America and not in India. So what's the fuss really about? That's the big question.
The judicial probe by an ex-High Court judge, which has been ordered by the government, is also not saying look at the corruption if it occurred in India. It says look at the media reports which have occurred
Right.
on the subject and get to the bottom of it.
Okay.
The other case, I suggested that let's discuss Walmart. The second case against Walmart is on an allegation that it might have violated the FEMA law because it routed certain money through its subsidiary in Mauritius to a company called Cedar Support Services,
Right.
which is a company of the Bharti Group.
Right.
The Cedar Services, in turn, probably invested into the Easy Day stores, which are run by Walmart.
Right.
Walmart and Bharti. Whether there has been any FEMA violation in it or not is an altogether separate matter.
Not to
from
do with lobbying at all.
Nothing.
Okay, so are you saying we're mixing two issues here, and that's the real problem? Mr. Mahendran, I'd like to go to you here and also touch upon one aspect that was raised by Dr. Kaushik Basu. He's quite clearly said he would like a world without lobbying, and that lobbying is a worry, and especially if our own laws are not strong enough, we land ourselves in the danger of these multinationals not, coming into a country just with the sole motive of making profit, which every corporate definitely has that motive. But he's raised this with a word of caution, saying that yes, we need to keep them in check, because just look at the kind of millions of dollars that are going into lobbying. They are obviously gaining access to foreign markets, and there is a clear word of caution coming from him. Your response to that?
My response, as far as that particular caution note given by Dr. Basu, I would agree with that. As far as that lobbying per se, from an Indian laws point of view, it is not acceptable. And of course, we have our own POCA laws, that is Prevention of Corruption Acts, etc., which clearly spells out in those the Indian statute that lobbying is against the law as far as India is concerned. But in the United States, when you look at the US corporations, it is pretty simple. As long as you disclose that and you have certain approvals on that, so it is, lobbying is pretty normal. But I would agree that as an Indian marketeer that we are players here, we would definitely feel that we need a lot of laws, stringent laws, that lobbying should be brought to lower level. I'm not saying that I won't be impractical saying that we should not have lobbying. But again, lobbying is for what cause? Again, if the cause is good. But in the case of multi-brand FDI thing, somehow I feel that it is jinxed. It's been in the government table for more than 10 years, and somehow with a lot of difficulty the FDI rules have been relaxed now from the overseas company to come in. But it's unfortunate that again this particular controversy has come. But in my view, that lobbying per se, yes, I agree with Dr. Basu on that. We should try to discourage that as far as India is concerned.
Mr. Mehta, are we seeing that increasingly, in order to gain access to newer markets, in order to, the clear pressures for making profits are leading firms to, in a way, lower their corporate governance standards? Would you believe that a firm that is disclosing that it's spent X million dollars in lobbying probably may have lower corporate governance standards from one that does not believe in lobbying?
Well, I think that's a bit of a stretch statement to make for two reasons. One is that the corporate governance rules, the principles of corporate governance are intrinsic to the culture, the corporate values of the company. And if a company is, abiding by good corporate governance rules, if the company believes in solid principles, if it believes that a company must maybe make profits in order to afford principles, but does not deserve profits if it does not have principles, then that company is going to abide by the highest standards of corporate governance, irrespective of whether there's a law or otherwise regarding lobbying. As I said, lobbying is a word perhaps that's got a negative connotation, but it is indeed a part of all of everyone's of activity in a democratic society. Now, countries like the USA have the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, UK has the Anti-Bribery Act, and I'm sure there are other countries which have very clear standards on what is a violation of corporate governance and what's a violation of the law of the land. And these countries, including in India, must make sure that companies abide by those rules. My own view is that if companies violate their own principles, violate the principles that make for good corporate governance, violate the principles that go against the interest of of society. They're going to not only lose their license to operate, they're also going to lose their license to grow. So it's bad business if companies do not have good corporate governance. It's bad business if they're in violation of the highest standards of principles and corporate values. But this does not mean that they should no longer seek to protect their interests. They should no longer seek to further those interests. And so long as they're moving in a direction or they're doing things that are within the framework of the law of the land, then I think it should be accepted. Now, in India, this issue of Walmart is essentially a political issue. Today we have this discussion, and it's not the first discussion that we are having on, frankly, what is a non-issue in a television channel like yours, only because it's become political. It's become political because the whole idea of FDI and retail has acquired political connotations. But if you just narrowed it down to the whole concept of lobbying, you will have to admit that it's very difficult to actually argue that lobbying per se is a dirty word. What is lobbying? I mean, lobbying is no more, no less than trying to, in effect, exercise your self-interest in a legitimate manner. And as I keep repeating, if you cross the line and you are doing an illegal activity, if you are bribing your constituents, if you're bribing the decision makers, then it is no longer, it may be lobbying for others, it is, however, an illegal act, and that must be prosecuted. So, at the end of the day, I'm actually still somewhat befuddled by anyone who is saying we must, contain lobbying, that we must contain the ability of companies to protect their interests, because by extension, you will also be saying, please contain and constrain the ability of consumers to protect their interests. Do not allow politicians to go out there and solicit votes. Make sure that trade unions are not able to protect the interest of laborers. And you go down, if you really go down the line, you're really saying in a society like ours, which is so diverse along ethnic, linguistic, regional, and other divides, that no one, no group, no particular group should actually have the right to go out there and espouse its interests. Now, that really is a fundamental statement to make, and I think it goes against the very spirit of a democratic society.
Okay, the larger point, okay, I know you have a point, very, very quickly before I go on to...
I think that essentially this is a good day to discuss this. There's the politics of it, as Vikram is saying, but there's also an interesting point that today, if you notice, the Ethics Committee of the Lok Sabha has for the first time said that members of the Lok Sabha, as opposed to just the Rajya Sabha, should sign up the register of interests.
Right.
So I think that it is a good time to discuss lobbying, because that is the horse and we are discussing the cart. So unless,
okay, that's an important point, but I'd like to actually ask one question, and I know Mr. Mehta has made this point all through, that this was, we were fussing about it, there was no need to make so much fuss about Walmart's lobbying disclosures. Why are we even having this discussion in the first place? Because we understand the viewpoint of all our panelists here today. But Vivek, let's try and understand it from the opposition's point of view, and we understand there was politics behind FDI and multi-brand retail. But here is a policy which is being debated in a country like India. We're trying to understand if it's going to work for India or not. There are concerns, and perhaps legitimate concerns, that the policy is being pushed by large multinational giants because it suits their interests. They would like to be in the Indian market. Here come Walmart's lobbying disclosures. On the back of it, several bribery charges that come, and we simply turn a blind eye to it and say, oh, it doesn't matter. Is it all that simple?
No, it's not that simple, and I would say I perhaps slightly take issue with what was just said before by Vikram. The politics, you can't sort of remove the politics from the equation. The fact is, policy is made politically. It's not made by economists, alas, it's not made by policy wonks. And so just for the context, and this, I mean, part of the answer to your question, Shweta, it's because opening up FDI and multi-brand retail has gotten so politicized because it has been a sort of a centerpiece of a long delayed reform agenda of this government, and finally sort of arrived magically at the 11th hour as really one of only a few pieces of reform agenda that they're finally doing, that it's gotten blown out of proportion. So as a matter of economics, I agree with Vikram. What's the big deal? It shouldn't be a big deal, and this goes on all the time, and Walmart is one out of many players, and lobbying, all of that is true. But if you look at the larger political economy context in India, number one, the fact that FDI has itself become politically charged, the fact that Walmart globally, not just in India but in the US itself, now in Mexico and elsewhere, has come under the scanner for allegations of questionable practices, and even in the US itself, as I say, Walmart is a polarizing factor that whether you like it or not, there's a sense that they've driven small shopkeepers in sort of middle America out of business. Now, it's good for the US economy, it's become much more productive, and those workers weren't very productive, and so on. But you can see how that would resonate in our Indian political economy, where those are exactly the concerns that were raised. So I would say that if one tries to separate the economics from the politics, yes, maybe we shouldn't be talking about it. But in the real world in which we operate, where you can't so easily disentangle the politics, the fact that we are talking about it reflects the fact that yes, this issue has become contentious, and the way it's been handled perhaps hasn't been ideal. And I think we need to, rather than sort of sweeping it under the rug, saying, well, let's let FCPA work its course in the US, we do have to make sure, given how important FDI has become to what's left, the fragments of this government's reform agenda, that yes, that everything was done properly, there was no undue influence, and that the choices the government made were made in the public interest. Because as Dr. Basu said in your intro package, we would love a world with no lobbying, but in fact that world doesn't exist. So lobbying will take place, counter-lobbying will take place, the US will lobby India, we'll lobby the US. So we'll never really know what factors were at play in the sort of those proverbial smoke-filled back rooms. But we want to know that the process was transparent, was fair, was reasonable, and in the end, the choices that were made by our government were made in the public interest, not in the interest of a foreign multinational or someone else. So I think that's the broader picture, Shweta.
I think that's true, but I'd also like to talk about the backdrop in which this controversy took place, Mr. Dua. The fact that... Yes, Mr. Mehta, go ahead. Respond to that, sir.
No, just one simple point, which I just wanted to stress. Every time that we talk about multinationals and whether or not multinationals were able to influence government and whether they went through the due process, we actually, in some senses, undermine the strength of our sovereign strength, our ability to counter the influence of multinationals. What surprises me is that we, as a country, and have the capability to counter the influence of the largest multinational, historically and otherwise. It's rather sad for everyone to be saying that a company like Walmart can come into this country and actually buy their way in a manner that compels all of these legislators to change policy against public interest. What is it that we're debating? We're basically debating one simple issue. Did Walmart break the law in India? And that fact is under judicial review. It's under investigation. The fact also is that Walmart as a company
investigation was
did
not
its own
needed at
internal
all,
investigation in Mexico.
But are you also making the point that the investigation was not needed at all? Because you're actually saying it was a fuss over nothing.
No, what I'm saying is this whole idea of lobbying and the argument that was just made, that basically these large companies come into this country and have the capability to influence the direction of Indian policy, is actually a slight against the sovereign authority of our country.
No, but I did not. Shweta, I must respond, because I certainly, if I'm the one that is being referred to here, certainly didn't claim that. The fact is that powerful multinationals do have a strong lobby influence. I mean, Walmart can certainly affect US government itself. So to say that Walmart could not have an influence in India, I think is very naive. Let's face it.
But what about the fact that Mr. Cherian, there may be corporates who are not spending the kind of money on lobbying as we're seeing other corporates do? Isn't it a case of an unfair advantage being given to those who are lobbying?
There's no unfair advantage whatsoever. It's got to do with business interests. Today, when Uttar Pradesh raised the price of purchase price of sugarcane, you immediately saw the Indian sugarcane manufacturers have lobbied the Indian government to say that you should rate the customs duty on import of raw sugar. So, you know, it is spontaneous. It's a business decision which is taken almost on the run. So
Is it a lack of understanding is all that you're saying?
What I want to convey is Walmart, whenever there is a discussion on Walmart, more heat than light gets generated. The question is whole lot of other American companies. And Shweta, just bear with me for a moment. If I was just to say, this year, 15 companies in the US, large companies have disclosed that they've spent certain amount of money in India, and which are the companies and what were the causes or the purposes for which they are spent, because they are required to spell out that as well. Pfizer, the pharmaceutical company, has spent money relating to Supreme Court decisions on generic medicine prices and patent-related matters in India.
Right.
Qualcomm and Alcatel-Lucent on spectrum licensing and preferential market access in India. Financial
but do we need to guard ourselves against this? Is the question. Do policymakers need to guard themselves against it?
Absolutely.
Because we need to know that this is simply a case of furthering business interests, which may not always be in the interests of consumers at large.
I'm saying exactly what you're referring to, that there are large companies which are organized, better organized than smaller ones, and better organized than people who are not well funded to put forward their cause. As long as they are doing it within a regulatory framework, I think we have to learn to live with it rather than deny it. If we are going to be saying that they are not doing it, that Indian companies don't do it, other foreign companies don't do it, I think we are living in a world which is not real. To just give you an example, the Indian government lobbied in the US by hiring a lobbying company when the nuclear deal had to be pushed through.
Yes.
Would you say that it's illegal? They paid money.
Okay, so there is not. We clearly need to understand that lobbying exists and is here to stay. But does India need better regulatory mechanisms to deal with the entire issue of lobbying? Do we need to understand it and differentiate it on a case-by-case basis? And more importantly, do lobbyists need to lobby on their own profession and clarify that it's not necessarily bad? All of that coming up after a short break. Don't go away. Welcome back. You're on We Mean Business, and we've been having an interesting discussion on lobbying, pegged, of course, on the entire controversy with regard to Walmart's lobbying disclosures. Mr. Cherian, a lighter question to you before we take forward this discussion. Why is it that lobbyists can't lobby about lobbying? You know, why is it that you simply cannot at least do an image makeover of that term? You know, the term has really become a dirty word.
I think lobbyists don't need to worry about improving their image. What the lot who need to improve their image is policymakers and politicians who are the so-called people who make policy. Who do you lobby with? There's got to be a demand cycle. You can't talk about the supply cycle. You know, lobbyists, all they do is they supply arguments. But who is demanding these inputs and who is demanding the so-called corruption? So, as far as I am concerned, we don't need to worry about it. What you need to worry about it is if you're sitting on the other side, who's being talked about.
And it's the integrity at the top, as Dr. Basu had said, is what matters.
At the same time, I'll slightly differ with Dilip.
Okay.
In India, you have a Corruption Act of 1988.
Right.
That act is for action against officials, politicians, officials, public servants who are
accepting
a reward for doing something which is otherwise a part of their duty. The question is, we do not have a Corruption Act against the giver.
Okay,
whether it's
that's
a
an
lobbying
interesting
company
point.
or it's a
Is there a case for one, Mr. Cherian?
You know, I think there is
will that help clean up the image?
I think the image and the process will get cleaned up, but it needs to begin, as I said again, and I agree with Mr. The point that Mr. Dua is making is valid, but the fact is, what is the perception? The perception is India, as Transparency International says, is among the most corrupt countries to do business in. So
which is why
and therefore the fear is that when you have such a corrupt system, somebody's got to be feeding that animal. Who's feeding it? Industry is feeding it. And where is it going? It's going into elections, or so they say. It's actually going into a whole range of things besides elections. But let's start with the simple stuff.
Okay, Mr. Mahendran, you've in fact been arguing against lobbying, and what most panelists here seem to believe is that it is something we need to learn to live with. It's not going away in a hurry, and it is something that we need to accept and not be in denial of. Given that fact, do you think there is a need for India to have a regulatory structure in place so that there's greater transparency?
Yeah, I fully agree, and I think India definitely needs regulatory situations to control this lobbying. And I strongly advocate that India should bring in these laws as fast as possible, because to my mind, this lobbying, if allowed in India as a legal thing or as a normal thing or a casual thing, it is basically it's an aid or it enables corruption, to my mind. So if you are anti-corruption and that's a way which is going on in India, certainly we need to discourage lobbying in India per se.
All right, Vivek, have we seemed to ignore the entire aspect of crony capitalism in India? Much as all the panelists today are arguing in favor of lobbying, are we clearly living in denial of the kind of corruption that exists in India, and the fact that the entire Walmart controversy came in the backdrop of a string of scams that have clearly embarrassed the Indian government, and the fact that we know that lobbying, whether it is lobbying on part of Walmart or it's lobbying that takes place in India, is something that exists, and probably the crossing of that fine dividing line is also something that has been proved in several cases.
No, that's a very important question. Just one quick reaction to what we just said. I mean, in a sense, lobbying is a substitute, a legal substitute, if you like, for corruption. So I think this notion that lobbying breeds corruption actually gets things exactly the wrong way around. It's because we don't have a legal system, a transparent system where lobbying can occur, that then people try to influence the government in some different way. And that can be through bribing or other ways, which then becomes a form of corruption. So as a matter of economics, when you have lobbying, you'll get less corruption and vice versa, which is probably one reason why we fare so poorly on transparency's metric of corruption. But on your wider question, I mean, sure, I think one should have a philosophical debate about the nature of crony capitalism, as you referred to it, about the power of global capital, if you want to put it in sort of those grandiose terms, and what kind of influence outsized players like Walmart, which is what we're talking about tonight, have on the policy-making process, whether in US, whether in India, or anywhere else. And certainly, again, as I said earlier, the taint or the charge, the sort of negative coloration that accompanies lobbying is because its history isn't very savory. I mean, Dilip will know that it's perhaps not the oldest profession in the world, maybe the second oldest profession in the world. So there's always been, as Dilip again said correctly, a demand for lobbying and a supply, someone willing to supply it, just like the oldest profession. So there's a certain basic economics there. And I think we've got to understand that. And again, if I can just run with that example for a minute, Shweta,
Sure.
If we don't like things, and we say, let's make it illegal, let's say pretend it doesn't exist, well, then it goes underground. Just like in the US, again, example, prohibition made selling alcohol illegal, so what you got was Al Capone and the mafia. So that's what happens when you deny that something like lobbying, and it's lobbying, and again, I think Vikram's absolutely right, it's not just multinationals, it's civil society, it's NGOs, it's think tanks, it's scholars like myself, it's the media, the fifth estate. We all have a view we want to put across to our policymakers. So the more transparent, the more open, the more inclusive that process is, the better for all of us, I think.
Okay, and you'd mentioned underestimating the power of lobbying. Do you think either by underestimating the power of lobbying or overestimating it, both extremes are extremely dangerous?
Absolutely right. That's absolutely correct. That we shouldn't be naive. We must realize that, look, lobbying is here. Lobbying is part of the scene, and in fact, it should be here. as an open, democratic, pluralistic society, everyone has the right to have their voice heard. So lobbying is here and it should be here. So let's not be naive about that. Let's not underestimate the power of major multinationals to influence their home governments, foreign governments, and that's fine. There's nothing wrong with that. But again, let's not overestimate the power of any one firm, whether it's Walmart or anyone else, to influence a particular government, because at the end of the day, the bottom line is that whoever takes that decision has to face the electors, the voters. And Walmart won't be voting in 2014. So the government has to make a decision that is going to resonate with the people of the country. And there's obviously always going to be a balancing of their personal political interest, their electoral interest, looking to the next election, looking at the polls, looking at range of issues. So let's keep a proper perspective. Yes, lobbying is here. We would like to have it regulated, bring it within the system, not have it sort of in the margins of the system, and neither should we overestimate how powerful it can be, because governments react to many things. Lobbying is only one of them.
Exactly. It's not necessarily because Walmart lobbied that we saw the Indian government going ahead with FDI and multi-brand retail. That's the point that some of our panelists are making here as well. Mr. Mehta, I'm going to start taking closing comments now, and I'd like you to respond to the entire issue of the need for stronger regulatory mechanisms in India. The fact that we've seen way too many incidents of crony capitalism, the fact that this country clearly needs to change its image with regard to corruption and corrupt practices, particularly being followed by corporates. And if you could also touch upon the entire controversy with regard to political funding, the fact that, do you approve of corporates giving money towards elections or towards political funding?
Shweta, many questions. I'm going to try and answer some of them very briefly. First, let me just make the point that if you were to look at the top, let's say 20 companies by revenue or market cap in 1990 and compare that to the same list in 2012, you'd find that very, very few of the largest multinationals that have entered this country make that list. The point I make is that these companies, and I worked for one of the largest of those companies, Shell, that have entered India, have certainly not been able to displace the Indian companies. And notwithstanding their money, notwithstanding their financial standing, there is a huge counterweight here of very solid Indian companies that have been able to hold their own and retain their top market and retain their market share, dominant market share. A company like Walmart may enter India, but I would put a bet on the table right now that it will be years before they acquire a significant share of the retail market. So do not overestimate the strength of multinationals, certainly not in the context of the Indian market. Second point is crony capitalism. There is no doubt in my mind that the nexus between politicians and business is much too close. This needs to be weakened. I think that it could be weakened and will be weakened if we have very transparent rules and regulations, and that this word lobbying, and call it whichever way you want to, is indeed subject to a very straightforward, transparent regulatory framework. This is certainly one way of undermining the nexus that exists today. In the process, the third point, I think it will also address the question of corruption in general. Someone made the point there's a law against people who take bribes. There should be a law also against those who give bribes. I don't think there's anything wrong with that statement, but I actually do make the point that companies, and I made that point earlier, that companies that actually start giving bribes in order to further their interest in today's connected and globalized world are going to find that their ability to operate and grow is going to be withdrawn and it will be eroded, and in the end the license will be withdrawn. It is much too simplistic to assume that these companies, by virtue of their financial authority or power, are going to be able to succeed in a country that has a consumer base that is now aspirational, knowledgeable, and will vote on the basis not just of the product but also of the values underpinning the corporate corporate conduct. And final point, should there be a more transparent system of political funding? Undoubtedly so. I think one of the main reasons, and I think no one will dispute this, for the level of corruption in our society is because of the nature of politics and the fact that a constituency of, I don't know, 15 lakhs or 20 lakhs per member of parliament is simply not possible to sustain and nurture without millions in one's kitty. And how does the politician raise it other than through political donations? If those donations are not transparently given, they will have to be secured through other means. So we need to address the whole issue of electoral campaign and electoral funding.
All right, that's very well summed up, and we're clearly out of time on the show, but 30 seconds closing comments, sir.
Let's have in the country a register of lobbyists, a compulsory lobbying register, and the government should consult only those persons who have registered themselves in policy making.
How does that help?
Straight away, you know.
Transparency,
and at the same time, a company which has engaged them, it must also declare who it has engaged for what.
So their client list along with
absolutely
issues
that and along with that, to ensure that there is no corruption or bribery taking place, very strong bribery bribery laws in position, and to finally to say that there is no indirect funding, political funding taking place. We must also strengthen not only the People's Representation Act or the Companies Act, but bring in position that if politicians have made money otherwise, they are politicians or bureaucrats, they are as liable to be punished as the person bribing them.
30 seconds. Would you be in favor of that suggestion?
I would be in favor of that suggestion, but I would be very frightened. Why would I be frightened?
Okay.
Because we are living in a globalized economy. If Indian companies, the Indian government and India doesn't get its act together as far as lobbying is concerned, this is a global reality. We will have more GMRs being thrown out of more Malays all across the world as Indian business attempts to go global. So do we want to do this? Yes, we do. Do we need lobbyists? Yes, we do. Does it need to be legal? That's not an issue. What's the issue is, do we understand what is this animal we're dealing with?
All right, and that's the larger question. Do we really understand the animal that we're dealing with? Lobbying clearly largely misunderstood in a country like India, and the recent case of the entire fuss over Walmart's lobbying disclosures, perhaps a case in point, and yet again a warning that we need to have better regulatory mechanisms in place to deal with the larger issue of crony capitalism. With that, it's a wrap here on We Mean Business. Many thanks all of you for joining us and sharing your views. Thanks so much for watching. Goodbye.